So my relationship with porn started at a very, very young age. In fact, I was about 4 years old.
Pornography is often compared to crack cocaine.
And now video gaming is an internationally recognized addiction according to the World Health Organization.
Substance use disorder is a major public health crisis.
This is 9/11 happening every 10 days.
The heroin overdose.
So, Brocke, what the fuck is happening in that video?
Something terrifying, honestly. Like, it's such a, I don't know, it's such an upsetting thing to sit and watch some of that stuff happen. And like, honestly, I believe in it. Like, I believe in some of that stuff. I do think it's convenient that we focus on these like aspects of, you know, looking at this type of behavior and trying to use it as some like characterization of a complex field or idea or drug use or whatever. I mean, you're taking a ton of different things that we use, you know, drugs and things for, and applying it to a bunch of people who obviously have mental health issues and all kinds of other issues that they're coping with in whatever way. But to me, that video is still evidence of this underlying mismatch of our environment, our modern environment, with how we feel inside, our motivators, what we want from life. And I think that all of us are compensating in some way. We're all trying to find some way to make things feel, I don't know, more connected to us or something like that. And I think obviously those people have chosen a route that has led to, because I don't think anybody would want to end up like that. You know, we talk about responsible drug use or whatever. We talk about drug use and like no one starts doing drugs thinking, well, maybe that'll happen. You know, maybe that feels great. Maybe it's super fun to end up one of those people on the street. So that's obviously, these are worst case scenarios for this kind of thing, but I don't think it's just the slippery slope of just using or accepting drugs in general as a society.
Hey everybody, it's Andre, joined by my co-host Levan. Thank you so much for supporting Radius of Reason, and I really hope you're enjoying this discussion with Brocke.
Don't forget to subscribe, hit the like button, and leave a comment below. Let us know what you think about drugs.
Yeah, I mean, you described like a very nuanced perspective on this clearly because you've had training, you think about this a lot. But I mean, the immediate reaction I think that the layman has, and certainly when I saw that clip for the first time, when the story kind of started going viral last summer, it was like, oh my God, like America is falling apart. You know, we have drug addicts on the street and the damn liberals are letting this happen. I mean, that was, you know, my particular narrative, but I know you could just see it in the comments section of videos like this. You know, this is from Philadelphia. Similar stories popping up, you know, all over the country lately. Oregon and Portland's been getting a lot of heat for this, but there doesn't seem to be like a nuanced understanding of why the hell, you know, we have these like very alarming tiers of crisis related to addiction in the country. I mean, do you think there's like any popular awareness of like the compounding factors that result in somebody on the street taking trank, shooting up heroin, things along those lines?
Yeah. I mean, I live in San Francisco, right? We have a huge fentanyl issue. I mean, I was surprised. I'm teaching actually this week about some drug stuff, and I one of the things that stood out to me recently is that in 2020, during a global pandemic, right, this massive event, you know, where people are dying on an accelerated rate, the number one cause of death between 18 and 45 was fentanyl overdose. Like that's an incredible statistic. And I really think that it underlies like why, like, it's not just fentanyl. Like we are sitting in our houses, right? This isn't just, you're not just on the street and we're all like walking around and people are just giving each other fentanyl and we're all like, ah. Like this isn't a party drug, you know, this is people sitting inside sad and going, how can I deal with this? And people going, well, maybe try this thing. It'll make it all go away. And then you know, could do this thing. And I think the drug is and fentanyl being one of the worst examples of this, is a compensatory thing for something that you feel is lacking, right? It's feeling, it's a, like I said, it's a mismatch between your physiological, like, and you know, the internal environment you have and this bizarre society that we've created, this modern thing of technology and, you know, going back to our last talk that we had, you know, capitalist kind of stuff that we've that we've just thrown all this stuff together, and it doesn't inherently, I'm not saying we can't handle it, right? It's not that humans can't handle what we're doing. It's just that it is such a mismatch, and it's made all of these things that with these underlying motivators and things that our instincts were built off of, and it's perverting them in a weird way. And so we are trying to compensate with this by taking drugs as almost like taking bad drugs, right? Taking bad drugs as a way of, just trying to throw something at the wall to make yourself feel better. Drugs are like the ultimate way of going, I can't make my brain stop feeling bad. So I'm going to take this thing that makes me temporarily not feel that way.
Brocke, do you think? Yep. Yeah, that makes sense. Do you think even just more mild, let's say, recreational drugs like marijuana are also problematic in the sense that, they're taking advantage of kind of this evolutionary mismatch in our environment. In the past, the emotions that drugs target were responsible for signaling like gains in fitness, right? You were happy or you were rewarded for eating or finding a mate or whatever it was. But now you're kind of bypassing those, evolutionary rewards, evolutionarily based rewards. And now you are just kind of entering a purely hedonic state, which then in a sense could be like, demotivating. And so, we're looking at harsher drugs, the opioid, epidemic and everything. But like, what about things like marijuana? I mean, are those okay to use too? Is there going to be a wider societal consequence as a result, like a collective societal harm if we've got people demotivated due to drugs?
Sure.
Like, what is your take on that wider issue?
No, I agree. I mean, these things all have trade-offs, right? I think that whenever I always wanted to do this large like scale study where you could basically, and a lot of this stuff comes back to chronic stress, right? Where you could see people that that smoke pot regularly, or even honestly cigarettes, which is like nobody advocates for cigarettes, but to do this like large scale study where you could see an offset of how these, like what the compensatory thing is, right? Because it is, don't get me wrong, smoking weed is messing up our dopamine systems, but so is our addiction to our phones and video games and streaming television and all this bullshit that we're constantly like just inundating ourselves with all the time, right? And our dopamine system is just fucked. It's just all over the place. And weed is definitely one of those contributing factors. These things are all consequential, but I try to see it as like what offsets what, right? Like one of the most important concepts in biology and physiology specifically is what's called homeostasis, right? It's your body's ability to compensate in a dynamic environment to keep internal like regulation, right? And this a lot of this is mundane, boring shit, right? Like you need to keep your calcium levels like very highly regulated, your phosphorus levels, your breathing rate, your blood glucose levels. All these things have to maintain a seesaw in your body of like, okay, if it gets, I mean, you could honestly argue that a good definition for disease is something that falls outside of like a homeostatic balance for too long, a system that's moved out of and that's how we define like a disorder or a disease. And I think that there are certain things that we do with our lifestyles that are throwing so much stuff out of a homeostatic dysregulation. And I think a lot of our modern environment really masks a lot of how we're being dysregulated in the sense of like, if you woke up tomorrow and you just had really low cortisol levels or adrenaline levels, like you would know it, you would feel it. You'd have low energy that day. I'm sure all of us have those days, right? We just wake up and you're like, it's going to be one of those days. And like, that kind of thing. You may not know it's specifically cortisol or whatever, right? But it's a thing. But when you have micro changes in cortisol over months or years that are just kind of ticking away and changing that system and making it worse or deactivated in certain ways, it's much easier to mask that and you don't know that's happening to you. But it's also a much bigger long-term thing. Like you are changing to a lower energy person or a less motivated person. Like your dopamine system, which is what, like today when we're talking about drug use, like drugs are all centered around like what's called like your dopamine reward pathway, right? It's a pathway in the brain that specifically has a bunch of different like areas of the brain, nucleus accumbens, ventral tegmental area and stuff, that are all like regulating dopamine use. And like we think of them a lot as reward in the sense of like, you inject dopamine straight into these areas and this yay, rah, I want to, but realistically that doesn't inherently make sense in like an evolutionary past where you think about why would we care that much about being like rewarded by certain things. But it makes much more sense in the context if you think of it about it as a motivational system, right? That's really how we look at dopamine, as like a carrot on a stick kind of thing, right? It's what makes you want to keep living. It's what makes you want to have certain behaviors that you should follow and go through. It's what makes you want to find a mate or want to, socialize in a group or whatever. And so we've caused a lot of homeostatic dysregulation to this system. And it's causing so much, it's causing a lot of gaps in our life, I think, that are we're not knowing exactly, like, you don't feel them happening. You don't know why they're happening. You don't know, like, we all know our phones are kind of bad for us, but we still use them and we don't see it as like, but yeah, and you don't directly aren't able to correlate, like, I'm using my phone right now and that is genuinely causing long-term damage to my like motivational system that's making me like life.
So that's a really important point that you made, because I mean, right now with what you're describing the phone usage, you mentioned earlier, people coping in the similar manner, playing video games, becoming addicted to pornography and sex, food addiction, but none of these maybe habitual responses to some of the problems in our life are being taken as like hysterically as somebody shooting up heroin on a street corner, which it's kind of like stating the obvious, but what to you kind of emphasizes the alarm and panic around some of these substances? I mean, for me, a lot of it comes down to the fact that it leads to death and that people are dying of opioid abuses. We talked about the coast, but I mean, we're not even touching the scale of the problem in the Midwest and some of the former industrial cities that got deindustrialized. But to me, it seems like we can't really make the same correlation as video games or pornography, because ultimately speaking, there are people dying from this. So should we be treating, I mean, there's often this conversation of, oh yeah, like we should treat all addictions the same. Coffee addiction equals trank addiction, right? But not really. And that's not necessarily a wrong perspective. What do you think?
No, I agree. I mean, like, it's so much of these things are so like drugs are just, when you like seeing someone like in the video, right? Like the trank video and fentanyl, seeing people on the streets doing these things. It's such a black and white, and it's such an American thing. I mean, like America just needs, they can't accept complex answers to problems. They just can't. It's why I've almost given up on assuming that we could ever do anything about climate stuff, because it's such a complex problem. And you're just never, Americans are like, what's the one thing I can do? What's the one answer? And it's like, there's not one. There's a lot of, but drugs are such an easy, convenient way of going, see, that's look, you did the thing. They're doing drugs. And now look at them. You can visibly, I can drive past that group of people and see that they are fucked up. And it's because of drugs. It's not because we have no mental health facilities in America that actually help to try and facilitate these things, or that we're all like kind of not sure what to do and we compensate in all kinds of crazy weird ways. Like the underlying damage like that we're doing to our health with like diet, right? We all know we're in an obesity epidemic and stuff, and like they know that's bad, but like you don't think about some of the effects that might be having on you mentally as well, and all these different things that we're doing with our diet. But it's a complex thing, right? It's a really complex thing to imagine. One of the things I like to ask like my students sometimes when we're talking about like kind of critical issues is like, is milk healthy? Like just as a question, like, is milk healthy? And you see all of them go, yeah, no, yes, no. And you've heard things like, oh, but it has calcium, but then it's also really high in sugar and it's got a weird, and there's just things like that. Like you don't know a lot of times what is good or bad with these things. So they're much more subtle and they have much more subtle, complex answers. And that's really the reality of it too. And I think drugs fit into that thing too. It's so easy to look at somebody on the street. And don't get me wrong, I'm not trying to downplay that thing. Fentanyl especially has become a massive crisis that we're all facing. But I think the underlying motivator that makes someone start the path towards fentanyl abuse, of what is ultimately going to become fentanyl abuse, is still a lot of the same drives that drive people to overeat or to go seek out too many sexual partners or get addicted to porn or video games. I think a lot of it is from this underlying thing that we all feel, I need something. There's something here I need to try and fill it with this thing because I can't do it myself.
Let's talk about that a little bit more, Brocke. Some of these underlying drivers of addiction and tendencies and predispositions to use drugs. I always, try to look at what the most important aspects of human nature are to kind of go to first principles, and consider things from that perspective. And I think about like human relationships, right? I think about how we're social creatures, and that is just fundamentally the most important thing about us. And then I think about the society that we've created now, and I think about, well, you talk about a mismatch in environments, there's a loneliness epidemic. I mean, we were, even before COVID, we were trending towards just becoming like digitized almost, where our entire world, or the vast majority of our experience, was now through a screen. So when we talk about, why people are doing things and how we can solve them, like even just having like additional mental health resources, clinics, education, like all those things, I don't see them as nearly sufficient because the core structure of society is antithetical to human nature in a way.
Yeah, no, I mean, no, I wouldn't disagree with you, right? And where do you go from that? Such a, we should just redesign society to make more sense with our, I was watching a documentary the other day about early tribal groups, other proto-humans that used to exist alongside us, right? And I was just thinking about those humans genetically, biologically, physiologically are mostly identical to us, right? Like you go back 40,000 years and we haven't changed really. Like our physiology has not really changed. We're utilizing Stone Age technology in, the modern age. And it's interesting because there's a tendency to look back at these people and think that they are primitive and that they were dumb, And yeah, if you brought one of those people back in this modern time, they wouldn't know shit about wars or technology or phones or any of the medical shit that we know about. But they had an intense, in-depth understanding of their local environment. They knew all the plants around them and what they were, what were harmful, how to use them, right? They had amazing navigational skills of giant swaths of areas that they would move around, and different seasonal things. They understood the environment, the weather better than as a tangible thing because their survival depended on it. I think one of the big things that we lost in the modern age is, and it's hard to bring this one, it's hard to make a case for this, right? Because it sounds like a bad thing, but we lost survival. That's not something, I don't wake up one day and I'm like, man, I sure hope I see a Burger King on the way to work today so that I don't die or something. That's not a thing that we ever feel anymore on this low key survival thing.
You hit the nail on the head, man. It's like we have a meaning crisis disguised as a drug problem, right? Because, as we've talked about many times on the podcast, what could be more meaningful than fighting for your life every day? Every meal is going to save your life. Every interaction could, potentially, destroy your status in your tribe. So the weight of every action is just completely unrelatable to us in the modern cozy environment.
It carries more gravity on a day-to-day basis. I think. No, go ahead, Brocke.
And there's something too that it's hard to advocate for that because it's yay, I'm glad we don't have wars and we're not constantly surrounded by violence. But that gave life this very significance to it, where you had to know things or it could cost you everything, you know? And you had to understand that every day was like a challenge. And I think that there is something we have like instinctual drives and tools within us that we used for those purposes that they're still there. They're still in us. We are still those like humans in the past were extremely violent, right? They really were. We love to try and like make these noble savage images, but there was a lot of violence in our past, and we had no problem doing in-group, out-group things where you would, could potentially wipe out a group of people just because they were somewhat of a threat to you. And I still think a lot of that is contained inside of us, but we don't know where to apply it. We're just trying to like reutilize these things where we're like, let's play a video game that kind of like simulates some of this stuff, or let's, go for a run and listen to some metal music, think about being a Viking on a ship, and it's just, I think we're trying really hard to find something to utilize some of those drives that are still like deep in us.
Have you guys heard of the book, The Comfort Crisis?
No, not at all.
So it's this book about a guy who basically goes to hunt caribou with a couple of other guys in Alaska. And so like he's totally detached himself from the modern environment, and he's just living in like a tent and just trying to like follow caribou and like hunt them. And I think like I think there's an issue with what is comfortable and what we find meaningful, and also what we are wired to do in terms of survival. Like human beings prefer almost comfort because it signals like a survival advantage, as opposed to doing things that would be more meaningful and potentially make us happier, but are less comfortable. And so like I think that's kind of one of the issues that we're finding in the modern environment. Like despite the mismatch in environments, we are kind of cognitively aware of the fact that if we were to do things that are less comfortable, if we were to go camping more often or whatever, we would have maybe richer, more enjoyable, more fulfilling lives. But there is this natural like draw to just kind of be comfortable and lazy. And of course it makes sense from an evolutionary standpoint. Like if you've got your basic needs met, why get out of your comfort zone? Like,
I just think
spend the calories, right?
I think it's really funny that motherfuckers are still writing books on this. Like Henry David Thoreau wrote Walden Pond in like 1854, and like the central tenets of his arguments were the same exact thing. That like, oh yeah, like society's industrializing and we're moving away from the things that brought us true meaning and joy, and the solution to that is to get reconnected with nature. And it seems like every couple of cycles of like upheavals brought about by industrialization, by the rapid approach of finance capitalism, you go through like crests and nadirs, and eventually you kind of have somebody squeeze out some sort of like manifesto saying that, oh shit, like, but like what if we like went outside more? And I suspect the further we get away from like that point of Genesis and like enlightenment, that whatever like caveman hit when he decided to like draw something on a wall, the further we get away from that, the more fucked up we're going to be, because Brocke, you put it very, very eloquently, and I think I'm going to rephrase this a little bit. Stone Age wiring, 21st century like realities, right? Like our amygdalas are still functioning with the understanding that we're going to protect ourselves against a wildebeest or like a cougar or something, but we're sitting inside our loft apartments in the suburbs of a given city X, Y, and Z. So there is this disconnect, and I think that's correct, and I think that's an important thing that we've said almost every single episode with varying thematic backgrounds, right? But at the end of the day, we still have a unique problem to our current circumstances where people are dying because of drug overuse. We haven't had this kind of problem on the scale in the United States before. This is a very like modern phenomenon. And you could, we could talk about the synthesis of drugs have changed, supply chains have changed, but this is something that is happening now that did not happen in the late 19th century under Thoreau, that did not happen in the 50s and the 60s. There's something unique about our current moment that is contributing to this very specific phenomena. And the question I guess I'm trying to pose is our lack of understanding of the issue causing it to kind of happen and grow out of control, or is there something else that we're missing here?
Yeah, no, I think that exactly. I think it is an underlying. On that note too, I don't like ascribe to any like specific philosophy, like I'm this or whatever. But I'm a big fan of Stoicism. I'm like a huge Stoic, and Stoic is all about the idea that a lot of times, your anticipation of things is what actually causes you the most amount of pain, rather than the actual thing happening. Like thinking, worrying, and stressing about losing your job is worse than literally losing your job. And they talk about how you should expose yourself to uncomfortable situations so that you know you're fine. Like an example of, and this is always a weird when people come to my house, is behind me is my mat right there that's rolled up, that I just rolled up a bit ago. I don't sleep. So my wife and I, we sleep in separate rooms because my wife is an extremely sensitive sleeper, and I am like a thrashing maniac at night, like awake the whole time. And so we sleep in different rooms. And I have my room, but I don't have a bed. I sleep on it's like a Japanese floor mat, right?
Like a tatami or something.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I started doing it because it was a Stoic principle for me, where I used to have a bed, and then I would just every so often, like probably one week a month, I would just sleep on the ground. I would just literally like throw a blanket on the ground with a pillow. And the idea is that you put yourself in these positions to go, I can sleep on the ground. That's not that bad. It's not a bad thing. If I ever get the scenario where I have to sleep on the ground, like that's how life is now, I'll be fine. And you expose yourself to these like more uncomfortable, kind of like the comfort book you were talking about, right? These things, and you realize there's something almost inherently rewarding of knowing that about yourself. Like, I don't have to always be in this comfortable thing. And Stoics often say, like, it's okay to seek out comfort. You can still have those things, but you should know that you don't need them. They're not essential to your survival. They're not essential to your well-being. And in some ways, they provide you, like, seeing the other side provides you a better perspective of that. And then to your point too, back to your point, if I was going to try to characterize this all into a single thing, right, which is never a great idea to do that, right? Like, it's a huge complex issue of our society and everything like that. But I think one of the biggest things that is like the underlying cause of this is chronic stress. Chronic stress is a very uniquely human disease. And in my opinion, and this is what I studied in in my graduate work and stuff, was chronic stress. And in my opinion, chronic stress is the number one cause of disease worldwide. I think you can take a lot of our mental health issues and a lot of our diseases, and you can track a tremendous amount of them to this chronic stress thing. And the interesting thing is our stress system has a bad rep now, right? Like, it has a bad reputation. You talk about stress and you almost never talk about it in a good way. But our stress system is a good thing. It's something that none of us would want to give up, right? Acute stress is like, if you're a zebra hanging out in some African grassland, and you're hanging out and you're eating, chilling, and eating some grass, and then a lion shows up, right? Your stress system kicks on, and it elevates your heart rate, it releases blood sugar, it shunts and prioritizes blood flow to your large muscles, it makes you more alert and stuff, because the idea is that I got to get the hell out of here. I got to run. This thing is going to kill me. And the difference between me living and dying right now might be how much I can push myself to get away from this scenario. And so a zebra, this thing happens, zebra immediately, boom, runs and just sprints away. Maybe when your buddy gets, taken out, and then you run, and then you go to a new area where you're safe, and you're like, and then you just go back to eating grass and chilling, being normal. Like, that's an acute stress response. If you looked at it on a graph, it would be like all these things happen and then woof, right? But humans have the amazing ability to metaphorically bring that lion into our lives at literally any point. And the thing is like, it's doing the same thing. Like, if I was eating whatever, an apple on a grassland and a lion show up, right? I'm running, I got to sprint, I get away. But then when I'm laying in bed at night and I'm thinking, oh my God, am I gonna be able to have, is my relationship gonna fall apart? Is my job gonna, like, it does the exact same thing. My heart rate goes up, my blood sugar spikes, my blood is shunted to larger muscles. And so we have this amazing ability to do this. And it's a very uniquely human thing. And I think that our modern environment ticks away at chronic stress in every kind of capacity. And again, I know we always come back to this, but I think that's one of the underlying things of capitalism specifically, because capitalism, one of its things that it literally consumes as a resource to make itself continue to grow is need. Capitalism has to keep constantly resetting that, like all of our needs are cared for. We are all in America, most of us, not really, right? Like some people don't have access to food and stuff as much as they need, and healthcare and all that other stuff. But overall, we have access to clean water, and food is pretty cheap here, and so we can figure that stuff out, right? But capitalism and the modern world has to keep, what do you need? And they do that. They sell us this stuff like, oh, it's Christmas time. Are you sad? Maybe buy a Lexus with a giant red bow on it, and then everything will be. And so you just keep getting inundated with these things of like, I'm not what I should be. And like, I live in a meritocracy and I'm not as successful as my friends are. And so I'm shittier and so you just live with this chronic stress. And I think that's what starts to push us to overeating or playing too many video games to the detriment of your life, or drug use, especially. I think one of the big underlying things of our drug use is that we are just overwhelmed, and we don't know how to find a healthy route to compensating for this, because a lot of things just don't make sense. Like dealing with chronic stress is a very complex issue, and it's a day-to-day thing, and it's a lot of lifestyle changes, and it's a lot of self-awareness. And it's so much easier to be like, I'm just going to take an opioid that'll just literally shut those pathways off, so that when the lion shows up, I'm like, whatever.
So that's an interesting thing that maybe you can expand on a little bit. Do you think, kind of in the work you've done in your own research, is there a deep enough understanding of stress within the medical community? As in, when a student goes through med school, how much time do they spend actually looking at stress and stressors and its immediate impact on somebody's physical health? Is that understood as a great problem within the general practitioners community, for instance?
That's a great question. I would say, just from my understanding of it, right? I would say that it's definitely becoming much more, right? It is becoming a thing that the doctors are absolutely recognizing as a very, very underlying thing. But I mean, because there's a difference, and I think that's kind of what I was really interested in this topic today about with drug use, is there's a difference between something that's like people look at and they're like, oh, this is a thing, and the normalization of that thing, like we've known about depression for a long time, and doctors and clinicians and stuff have known about depression for a while, but it's only, this might be, I don't know, I feel like it's only in the last 30 years that we've really been taking it actually kind of seriously, where we're actually saying no, depression, people aren't just sad. Going for a walk doesn't correct that. People are fucked up when they're depressed. And this is a thing that we need to all acknowledge and work towards and all be open about and communicate about. Man, I'm depressed. I'm having a bad time. And we need to be able to talk about that as a species, And I think that chronic stress is peaking out, right? It's coming into that thing where people are seeing that our lifestyles are stressing us the fuck out. There's a guy, Barry Schwartz, wrote a book called The Paradox of Choice. And he talks about how in our modern age, we have so many choices for things. And it feels like a good thing, right? I want choices. I want to be able to choose all the different stuff that I want for and customize everything and make everything. But realistically, data is showing that it's driving us nuts. When you go to the grocery store and you're like, I want cookies. I'm going to go pick up cookies at the store. And you walk into the cookie aisle and there are literally 9,000 cookie choices. You need it. You're like, I guess I should make an Excel sheet. What is my priority of what I want from cookies? If there was one cookie there or two cookies, you could go, I don't want that one. It's gross. It's got raisins in it or something, right? I want that one. Give me that cookie. And you're going to be happy either way. You're going to do cookies fine. Right? You just wanted sugar, whatever. But having to see 50 different options of cookies and decide what you want, maybe in that moment, it's not pushing you over the edge. But when you have day after day, a day filled with that decision of, I have to make a choice. I don't know if you guys have the decision paralysis when you sit down with Netflix, right? You start looking through and then you're like, fuck this. I'm going to watch the same show that I've seen 1,000 times because I don't want to sit and try to rate. It also makes everything feel worse in comparison too, because not only it's I have a whole thing. We could have a whole nother episode on this concept of modern dating, because I think Tinder and all of version of that, right? Because it devalues every other choice. You're like, you look at a person and you read their thing and you're like, oh, you got the stuff. And you're like, I'll give a shot. But just know, person that I don't know anything about, you're compared to 200 million other people that I've just swiped through that I could potentially go on dates with. And it just devalues every choice that you make, because there's like 100 ones waiting. And so every show has to perform for you, because you're like, I don't know. You remember like growing up at a time, like when you just like had TV and you'd like turn USA on, and then like halfway through a movie and you're like, fuck yeah, this movie's great. I don't know what happened at the beginning, but now every movie is competing, every show, everything is competing for our constant attention. And so it just devalues everything that we do. And I think that choice
it also devalues the options themselves, in the sense that, you know, it's a race to the bottom to be the most attention grabbing to the widest audience possible to maximize ad revenue or whatever revenue. And ends up being like worse. Like, you know, like you could, like 20 years ago, you put on USA, maybe Top Gun is on, or like some cool movies on, and it's great. And now, like, it's all shit, pretty much. You know, look what happened to the film industry, quite frankly.
Like, I'm not trying to like do a thing, whatever. People, I listen to modern music. I work out. I listen to fucking, you know, the stuff that we listen to is of Justin Bieber and shit. But we cannot deny that these are the same songs that are being made over and over. It's the same chord progression. It's the same beat. It's literally, some of them are written by the same two guys, right? Like Dr. Luke and Max Martin and shit. And it's because it's a formulaic thing where it's not designed to be good music. It's designed to just get in your head and make you do a thing for a second, and then you listen to it 50,000 times, and then you're like, I never want to hear the song ever again. There's a reason why Rolling Stones and Pink Floyd and Led Zeppelin stand the test of time, because they were making music that was meant to be, they just put music out, and everybody was like, holy shit, that's good music. And, you know, we kept listening to it. Now music is designed to sell Pepsi and to do this thing, and it's like a whole different purpose of it, right? And so yeah, I agree with you. Like, it's all just creating these like auction things. But I think back to that original point is that we encounter these constant decisions, we encounter this constant thing, and these feel like good things. Like, I don't think anybody would be like, oh, I want there to only be 2 cookie choices. You know, like I want to live in a world where there's only 2 cookie choices. But your brain wants that. Your brain doesn't want 100 cookie choices.
You know, there's a level of irony to that, because there's like a saying that's repeated that the Soviet Union was brought down because there weren't enough choices for like sausages at the butcher. Where like they go to like the meat store and you just have like the sausage or something like that. Yeah. And when it came to consumer goods, the Soviet like model for a planned economy wasn't able to accommodate for the needs of the population writ large, which created a scarcity mentality, but more so it was the knowledge that in the West, in the United States, you had, you know, the aforementioned aisle of like 60 different cookie types that ultimately speaking bred all that resentment. And it's often, you know, kind of the stereotypical joke that, oh, like the Soviets were like without style. Everybody was wearing a great potato sacks as their like state issued uniform. They're all dating the same state issued model of girlfriend, like all that kind of stuff. But I mean, could you make the case that a lot of this, it's less about kind of a paralysis of choice, maybe more so a anxiety associated with comparison, where, yeah, okay, like I'm getting the chocolate chip cookie, but I know that, you know, my neighbor 2 streets over living in like a bigger house is getting like the higher end chocolate chip cookie, and the constant frames of comparison between your status versus the status of those around you. And because it's being defined now, you know, by the parameters of consumer goods, you're always stressed because you're trying to compete with somebody else's signifiers of status to a certain extent.
And if I can piggyback on what Andre just said, you know, does that beg the question, you know, is social media the most dangerous drug of all? Ooh. In the sense that, you know, if comparison is the thief of joy, then what do we have here?
Yeah, like the data has shown that people are consistently happier being the richest person in a less rich neighborhood than being the poorest person in a rich neighborhood. Like that, just that difference. It could be you could have the exact same net worth, right? But if you're living in the rich neighborhood, but you have the smallest house and the crappier car, then all the people driving all the nicer stuff, versus living in the less nice neighborhood, but you're the rich person. You got the better house. That is the top tier thing. People just inherently want. Comparative stuff for us is such a big deal. Like, it's such a big societal thing. So I agree with you that, like, a lot of it's got to be centered around, like us, not being able to, like, I don't know, like, not being able to find the significance in just having these things inherently, right? Like, you just don't find a value inherently in them. You need to know that it's doing something better for you, or in the societal thing, or that it's giving you some kind of, like, status stuff is such an underlying thing for us that we don't always, like, especially as you get older, I think you start to want to decrease that need for that kind of thing of status or something. I don't know. I feel like I have anyways, like, where I've tried to, like, really manage that about myself, where I'm not doing the status thing as much, but it's still something. It's still, like, if I lost my status, I would be devastated. It would be such a humiliating thing for me if I just, like, everybody was like, no, that guy's a dumb piece of shit. Look at him. And you're just like, ah, like, status is still such an important thing for all of us. And so I think you're right. Like, the more choices we have on those things, and the more some of that stuff has, it's hard to identify with. Like, I think too, like, when you have all these things too, like all these choices and all these amazing stuff around us, it also internalizes it too, to be like when you are sad or depressed or dealing with some kind of issues or whatever, and you can't understand why, you look around and you're like, I have fucking everything. Like, I have more stuff available to me than, like, a king had 300 years ago. Like, I there's nothing I lack. And you're like, so what's wrong? Why am I upset? Why am I sad when I have so much stuff? And then you internalize it. It's just like, I'm broken. I'm messed up. I am. Mm-hmm. And I honestly think that's where a lot of it comes back to the drug thing, because I think drugs are one of those. Some people just get into drugs for all kinds of reasons, right? But I think drugs is one of those things that, like, you start to get into sometimes when you just have tried other things and they just didn't work. And you're like, what could I do to help make me feel something, to feel better? Like, obviously these things around me aren't doing it. And so I think some of the choices and statusy things that we have like that are just making us feel.
Brocke, let's talk about that a little bit. So, drugs, and not just when we say drugs, I mean, let's expand this word, right? Like, we're talking about Cheetos, we're talking about Doritos, Andre mentioned porn, video games, caffeine, sugar, like, all this shit could be categorized as a drug using that term broadly. And these are all, like, hypernormal stimuli, right? That you just would never find in the natural environment. And, like, what does that do to our dopamine system, etc.? Like, could you say the act of trying to create a more and more pleasurable experience is almost self-defeating, in the sense that you're raising the baseline of what you need, and the activities that drive you are kind of junk food equivalents of what they used to be in the past. So is there some sort of self-defeating phenomenon occurring with us making kind of cheaper, more accessible, dopamine hijacking things in society?
So that's such a great point. One of my favorite things to talk about when I talk about, like, drug and addiction and the abuse pathway and stuff is the concept of tolerance in your brain, right? And we all kind of, like, I think people have a vague understanding of what tolerance is and, like, how it moves into an addiction pathway. But, like, tolerance isn't just some drug related thing. It is a thing that is a compensatory mechanism for your brain to manage, again, homeostasis, right? It's a huge component of homeostasis in your brain. And basically the way that it works, and this is anything, sugars, video games, porn, you meeting someone, right? What happens is when you first get excited about something, like anything, any of those things, right? You eat something, you get this thing, right? Let's say you meet somebody, right? And you have that moment where you're just like, you meet this person and you guys are talking, you're staying up late and you're texting and you're having that thing, right? You're connecting. And, like, what's happening is in your brain, your motivation, you're literally releasing reward chemicals. They're, like, causing this to be like just this, the reward chemicals are up here. And I'm like, I love this. Every time I think about this person, I'm just, wow. And that's awesome. Like, we love that. We are all addicted to those feelings. They're amazing. And they are just, like, the best, right? But the problem is your brain subconsciously, it doesn't like that. And the reason why is because Your brain is managing 8 trillion things. Like I said, mundane shit. You know, your oxytocin levels, your levels. How much iron do I have in me right now? These are things that we consciously don't give a shit about. I can't even imagine if I had to like maintain my own calcium levels or some shit like that. And so my brain is doing all this stuff in the background. It's just like, you know, it's like when you open your computer and it's like you see all the things that like what are the like little like task manager or whatever, and showing all the million things it's doing in the background. Like your brain is doing tons of shit where it's keeping all that. And when you take something like dopamine and you just dopamine isn't just a reward chemical. It is associated with memory retention. It's associated with movement. And so you use it for tons of other things. It's not just reward. And so when you're making your dopamine levels, like they should be right here, and you're putting them up here with whatever that thing is for you, you know, playing video games, you know, seeing this new person. That's not inherently a bad thing. Your reward system is meant to have these extreme things, right? It's a motivational system. So it's like, yeah, go hang out with that person that they could be great for you. You want to stick your genitals in them, right? And so you just do this whole thing. But the problem is over time, your brain goes, oh, okay, buddy, I can't have this level of dopamine all the time. Every time you do that, you're setting your phosphorus levels in weird ways. You're making your breathing rate change to weird levels. And your brain is having to compensate, going, hey, I don't need, 40 breaths per minute right now, buddy. Like, we got to take that back down. And so it starts to basically work against your own motivational and reward system, right? And it does that by a bunch of different ways. It'll like physically, it'll take your cells. You have receptors on the outside of your cells where like things like dopamine attach, and they cause the effects that dopamine have in the actual neurons, right? Your brain will downregulate those receptors. It'll take them away. It's like, hey, look, this is happening too much. So they will start to remove those receptors on the outside so that now you need more dopamine. This is, the addiction pathway. You need more cocaine to make that happen, right? And so it'll move some of those away. And we call this tolerance, right? It's basically your brain trying to compensate for a dysregulation of your homeostasis by going, okay, I don't need that much dopamine, so chill the fuck out. And so you start to see this person.
Brocke, is that evolution's way of addressing diminishing returns on like a pursuit of a thing?
I think so, yeah, because you can't just love something and do it to the detriment of everything else, right? Like that's just not a good survival skill to have, And so I think in some capacity our body, and it's also just the the collateral of running an extremely complex physiological system, right? Like everything has to be in balance. And like also, and I think we talked about this before, but like humans, this is one of those concepts that I think as you get older and more self-aware, you have to understand that humans aren't inherently made to be happy. That's something every one of us wants. But your body isn't designed to keep you, loving life all the time. That's just not what it's there to do. And so we want that, right? We subjectively want to feel good every day. No one wants to wake up and go, all right, I need a good shitty day. I need to offset my good days. I should have a shitty day. None of us ever want that, but like your body can't, it's not there to do that for you, right? And so I think in some ways those things, that tolerance system is set up so that, like you said, diminishing returns, right? So that we don't do other things at the detriment of, all the other things that we need to be caring for and all the things that your brain needs to be caring for. And so you can insert any of our addictive things right now that we're focusing, food, video games, and especially drugs, and they all play into this system where you are trying to game the system, right? You're trying to be like, wow.
Yeah, I think you actually said something really, really important, Brocke, that I did want to emphasize again, is that by nature, the way that our body is structured, the way that our neurochemicals kind of relate to one another, we are not supposed to be in a constant state of elation or happiness, right? At best, we'll get neutral with a couple of bursts of fuck yeah within like a given time frame. You've talked earlier that a lot of our responses that kind of manifest in what would be seen as detrimental behavior, addictions and whatnot, is a direct correlation to the fact we're living in a civilization that is not in line with our nature, with our internal chemistry. Is that one of the reflections of our current civilization that we've built up? Is this expectation that's put upon us that we do always have to be happy, that there isn't enough discussion of hey, it's totally okay sometimes to be neutral or less than neutral, right? That it's totally okay to have bouts of depression. That, even our conversation that we've had in the past 45 minutes or so, everything is about like, well, how do we treat these things that people feel, the anxiety, the depression, the insecurity that we feel. But could there be a greater emphasis on, hey, all of this is natural and all of this is a phenomena that is necessary to human life as it stands? Like, do we need a greater emphasis on just the regular nature of being sad?
No, I think we need to normalize just being, that it's okay to just be a shitty human being sometimes.
Okay, all right, I like that.
That we're just like that. Like we are just these things, that we don't have to always be this Hallmark movie version of whatever we see ourselves as. We all want to just wipe all the bad things off of those of these people and who we are and stuff. It's like celebrity culture and stuff. And we look at these people and we're like, what? They cheated on their spouse or whatever. And it's like, yeah, of course they fucking did. Everybody does all these fucking things. And I think that it's weird that we just always constantly set up, stuff to like try and counteract who we are just at our very, and that doesn't, I'm not trying to say a fallacy of we should like be happy with those things or whatever, but we should acknowledge that we are fallible people that do this stuff. And depression is a part of our existence. It probably always has been. And so these things, like, it's part of it's honestly part of this stuff, like chronic stress and depression and mental illnesses and the reward issues are part of like, there's a Norwegian philosopher, Peter Zapf, and he talked about how he was an anti-natalist, saying that humans are fucked up and should die off. So we should stop reproducing. And he said that consciousness is a double-edged sword, that you grasp to wield and understand this amazing stuff about the world, but you also have to turn it inwards to yourself and to knowing that all this shitty things and to analyzing your own thing and your own mortality and your own place in existence. And it's maddening. Like, he thought like it was a mistake, that human consciousness it's cool. It's cool that we got to this level, but he's like, but it's fucked up. It's a fucked up thing for us all to have to live with. We can do this to ourselves all the time.
I want to, yeah. Can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah. Clear.
Cool. Yeah, I want to double down actually, Brocke, on what you and Andre also touched on, in that we're not, designed to be happy. We're designed to survive and reproduce, and so I think I really think that's one of the take-home messages for people here is like, you are not supposed to be happy all the time. And one of the other things that you mentioned, Brocke, was that the anticipation of pain is usually more painful than the actual thing itself. Well, the inverse of that is also true. The anticipation of the reward is typically more rewarding than the reward itself. And so another take-home message related to the fact that you shouldn't expect to be happy all the time is that try to pursue goals. And actually, the more distant the goal is, and the more you can kind of incrementally approach it, that might be a way of almost like hijacking, or not hijacking, but, kind of almost getting around that thing and having a higher baseline as you approach the reward, if that's what you're seeking, So just my 2 cents on that. But
yeah, no, I first of all, research has shown that anticipation of reward is actually considerably more rewarding than the actual reward itself. And I think, oh man, I just lost my train.
So here's a quick example that I forgot to mention, but the podcaster Tim Ferriss, the self-improvement guy, 4-hour work week,
4 hour,
what he does is apparently he sets vacations like years in advance, and he just gets really excited to go on them, and like it's just this little constant stream of dopamine in a sense. So that's just like one practical way you could do it.
No, I think that's chaining that out and understanding that is a huge, I think, growth point as a human, right? Getting older and understanding that like you don't need everything right this very second. And like you were saying too, with like humans we aren't really meant to be happy and stuff. And I think an understanding that like it's okay for you to feel certain ways. And that like these things are inherent parts of who we are. Like they make us, like there's offsets, right? Some things about being able to have chronic stress pushes you to do some things that you enjoy about yourself, right? But also have the consequence of detriment to certain things like that too. An interesting thing is like schizophrenic people, right, are, when we think of like people that are like really struggling mentally with certain things, schizophrenics typically fall into a large, like a big part of that thing where we think of like, oh, these people are, you know, like really mentally aberrant a lot. They think about things differently and they struggle with things more. And they are, when you look at the stats, they are 1% of our population, which is a massively huge percentage of our population. I mean, it's like 1 in every 100 person is schizophrenic, has schizophrenic tendencies. And when you see a massive thing in the population that's been retained evolutionarily for this long, it's like, why would that have existed? Like things don't stay in a population like that if it's that detrimental. And research has shown, one of the things that they've shown is that like, despite the fact that that it looks like they aren't fitting into our deal as much or our society, or they struggle more with, you know, keeping jobs and things like that, they fuck a lot. Like at the end of the day, they are having a lot of kids. Whatever thing with schizophrenia comes around with it pushes them to have a lot of kids. And sometimes it's just that, right? Like you said, we are sexual machines meant for this thing. And so when you start to look at your reward thing as a different thing than what we want it to be, you can find a more, I think, realistic approach for what it should actually have, and that you shouldn't always have to be happy and fulfilled all the time. Like fulfilled is such a stressful thing to try and walk around feeling all the time.
Yeah, in the book Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman, he makes that distinction between the remembering self and the experiential self. And I think that's a useful perspective here too, because what you do when you're constantly on drugs is you're almost trying to optimize for the experiencing self, but that comes at the cost of the remembering self, which is the self that I think recognizes how meaningful your life may be, and how fulfilling it genuinely is. And I think our society is just way too overwhelmingly focused on the experiential self at the devastating costs of the remembering
that goes to
self.
Your like the meta crisis thing you guys were talking about with that, of just like these seeking out short-term gains constantly at the detriment of our entire society. Like we are just, I'm teaching about climate stuff recently, and you know, when you teach it to students that haven't really been exposed to this that much, they're just shocked at first. Where they're like, "Why aren't we doing anything?" And it's like, we all know that it's bad. And it's like, yeah, but you need oil companies, executives of oil companies, to cut their own pay right now to invest in some of these things that are going to exist, that are going to help us 50, 100 years from now. And like, you just don't see that attitude. People go, they don't, day to day, they don't think about that. They don't care. They're like, I want an extra beach house. And so then they just keep these same policies, or they make worse ones, whatever. And so we're all kind of working toward our own demise because we are just thinking about tomorrow and next week, and not how this is going to affect us in 10 years from now, 20 years from now, or our kids or grandkids or whatever.
That's a great way to discuss some of the perverse incentives that we have currently when it comes to pharmaceuticals and kind of other drug. I mean, even marijuana. Like, let's talk about that. Like, what are some of the perverse incentives in the drug industry that are kind of exaggerating the problem, which as we've discussed is based on a host of other issues, but there are also just kind of these systemic perverse issues that are compounding things. So like, what are they?
So with drugs, man, drugs are such a like an interesting phenomenon. I've seen people use them for, you know, whatever motivators and things that people use them for. Is they do come with like heavy consequences, right? And I think a lot of time when you're trying, and that was kind of what I wanted, the message I wanted to take was like ethical drug use for this, right? Because everything has an unethical and ethical version of it. There's just, you know, nothing is inherently bad. And a lot of people love to look at that video at the beginning, right? And fentanyl use and stuff and go, oh, no, this is bad. This is just, this phenomenon in general should have a big red X on it. But I think there's ethical use for both ways, right? And so a lot of drug use does come with certain consequences that, you know, we use to compensate for certain things that are in a long term not good for us. But I think that if we can normalize like some of this more drug use stuff, and not that I'm advocating for people just smoking weed all the time and doing that thing. There are trade-offs that are negatively impacted with those, especially the amount of weed that people smoke and stuff. But living in California has really awakened me to
THC. So I read THC potency went up from 4% to 15% over the past decade.
That's part of the thing too, is like we've been using drugs for thousands of years. But when in the past, we didn't have the technology to make drugs what they are now, the way that we do everything.
Yeah, like synthesize and distill, yeah.
Yeah, such a human trait. There are so many things that are just like specifically human things. And what a human thing is to go, hey, I like that thing. Let's find the underlying root thing that we can distill from it. Like sugar is a great example. If you've ever seen like a sugar cane plant, right? Like they are these massive fibrous things. If you want to eat a bunch of sugar, right? From that kind of setting, you would have to sit and chew through a shit ton of fiber. It would take you a long time to get through it. Humans were like, that stuff tastes delicious. Let's take it and refine it and get the powder of it, right? Like coca leaves too, from cocaine. We would all be giga chads if we were doing that. Our jawlines would be yeah, like biting through the same. Indigenous groups in South America have been chewing on coca leaves as like a form of like almost like coffee for a long time. And you know what? In that form, it's fine. You chew on coca leaves and it is like coffee. It's like a caffeine type deal, right? You just get it and you're like more motivated and you're like, all right, time to go to work, whatever. But humans were like, oh, hey, there's some kind of chemical in those leaves. Let's take it and refine it and distill it into the worst possible thing. And then just take it straight so that it just goes right to our brain and we do it in the bad way. And I think that one of the things that I really want to see in the more modern age of us viewing drugs as less of a, like a thing that we can, could be good or bad or like a recreational kind of thing, and more as the use of like more of a prosthetic kind of example. Like, for instance, we consider in our modern age certain things that you have that are like, if you have a certain problem with some kind of like body part or like your vision and stuff, we correct those things. Like if you can't see, like I can't see, if I take these off, my vision sucks. And sometimes I get that. I'm like, wow, if this was a natural environment, I'd have glasses or whatever. Like, I'm not seeing stuff that great, right? And this would just be me, normal. And so, but society goes, no, you need to be able to see. You drive cars, you interact with certain things. You need to be able to see well. And so they compensate with stuff like this. Hearing aids. Even if you lost a hand, and if you could afford it now, we can make a fully functional, amazing prosthetic that can probably better than hands, right? In the future, we're going to make like cyber hands that'll do all these crazy things. And so we consider that to be an essential thing. But I think that with our modern environment just making us all fucking nuts and like depleting certain chemicals in our brain and stuff, all these things over time, I think that drugs should start to be more normalized in a way of looking at them as a prosthetic compensation, right? Where we're like, look, my environment is making me deplete my goddamn serotonin so much that I don't know how to change that. I don't know how to make my serotonin system be more healthy and better. And so I can take this thing and it's like, yeah, cool. Now that helped get you more in a thing that helps you do the things you need to do and stuff. The problem that makes drugs so bad, and one of the reasons that it's gotten to this thing where people like, and let's be honest, like, yeah, we're using more drugs than we ever have before, but they are still mostly seen as bad. Like, this is America, and this is the largest, we use drugs more than anybody, and they're still bad here in America, right? To some degree. But like other countries, you can be imprisoned for life for smoking weed, or even like, I think Thailand went like you can get killed, and so we are still not an age where there is a normalization of drug use. And I think that once you start normalizing a subject, then the actual conversation can move to a more complex, complicated discussion where we can start to go, okay, let's start finding drugs that have less consequences, where when you smoke weed all the time, like, what can we do to try and make a less potent strain of weed that like has some of the offsetting stress kind of things that we like from it, but also you don't want to just sit on a couch and just meld into the damn couch like that. And I think that once we start doing that, we can start to create like, imagine a world where you could have drugs that like help facilitate memory retention. You take a drug and like you just in that moment you have better memory retention, right? So you're like studying and you're getting more out of it in that like impactful moment. Or a drug that like helps you socialize better. You go to a setting. I mean, alcohol's been that for thousands of years, but it comes with so many heavy consequences. Imagine a drug where we could try to isolate something and you take it, and like now in a social setting, you're much more open to communicate with others and to listen to them and to care and to emote and stuff like that. I think there's so many things that we have access to that we won't discuss. It's like out of the Overton window because we're all just like, well, we can't talk about that because drugs are ultimately bad, right?
So, and I don't think what you're saying is, yeah, we should go and legalize, heroin, or we should legalize crack cocaine, like, open the floodgates, baby. It's a big party on the streets. I get what you're saying is, these drugs kind of trigger certain receptors in your head. And if we had that institutionalized and researched, we can kind of create these at an at-need basis. And I think part of the reason you very accurately said that, yeah, the pushback that you're always going to get when you have those kind of conversations, it's always going to be informed by video clips like we started the episode with, right? With, zombie-like individuals roaming the streets, kind of a dehumanization of the nature of addiction, which we've broken down throughout our conversation. But I think on principle what you're saying is correct, but there's a couple of stages we need to resolve before we get to more of like a maybe sterile production of narcotics of drugs to meet individual needs, right? What prescriptions would you have for the immediate problems we're facing now, right? For we've talked a lot about case studies. Let's talk about, Portland's been in the news a lot lately. In 2020, they again passed Measure 110, which decriminalized the possession of certain amounts of drugs. That wasn't quite as effective on the surface. People are complaining about Portland essentially becoming an open air drug market, but there's a lot of compounding stuff, right? There wasn't enough financing for it. The programs that were supposed to sustain it with treatment options weren't funded appropriately. But right now, you have a clear-cut issue in the case study of Portland, Oregon, where drug usage has increased, drug deaths related to the kind of integration of fentanyl into the drug cycle have increased at a proportional level. What is our step here? Is it continued decriminalization and staying the course? Is it making everything illegal and never talking about it again, which, clearly that's not anything productive that could happen based on our current conversation. Brocke, what would your immediate prescription be for this situation if you had the reins of power?
So Portland is a great example of that, right? It hasn't worked. Whatever is going on with what they're trying to do isn't functionally working because they are having a massive crisis with fentanyl there. That being said, though, I think the underlying motivators or like the underlying thing that they were trying to do, I still do kind of believe in. Like, I actually am kind of for decriminalization. And it's not because I think, oh, yeah, woo, everybody should just be able to do drugs and that's part of freedom. And it's more of a offsetting drugs from a criminal jurisdiction to a mental health jurisdiction.
Right.
If there is a guy that is in a gutter and they are on heroin and they are fucked up and their whole life is trash, that is not, to me, that's not a criminal issue. That is that person is having a crisis. And a more empathetic society would view that person as somebody that needs help, not somebody that needs to be locked away, right?
Right.
I understand
Precisely.
it also does come with desperation, and people are willing to violently do things that they might not normally do to get drugs or to get money for that. So it does come. I'm not trying to pretend that it does not come with crime issues and things like that. It does, but I don't think the overall use of drugs and these like big amounts of this stuff is really specifically about as a criminal activity. And so I would agree that I think, and I know these are like buzzwords that are easy to throw out, like, oh, we need to improve our mental health system and we need to have a better lifestyle and yeah, sure. And that shit's hard to do. And we're all, everybody, even the most healthiest people on the planet that all have all the things we need, all of us are still going, like, is this what we're supposed to be doing? So, I mean, what are some of the most people that use the most amount of drugs, like career-wise, are doctors, MDs, people that prescribe it. They have a huge epidemic with drug use, right? I mean, they're the people that are literally studying and prescribing these things. And so But I think doing things like decriminalizing drugs and trying to normalize, right? And governments coming out and, like you said, if I was in power, right, governments coming out and trying to help normalize these things and make them a discussion. Like, look, I get that you people feel dissatisfied and that you're compensating in all kinds of ways. Let's see if we can start to expand the conversation on this, normalize things. Like, I'll give you a real like subjective example, anecdotal. Like, my dad is depressed and he will never admit it. He is part of that old blue collar conservative, I'll be sad till I die kind of, mentality. And my God, if he smoked weed, he would be such a better person. He would be happier. His whole life would be better. He would stop getting angry about everything all the time. And but he'll never do it, right? He'll never do it because to him, weed that's alien. That's a bad thing. It's I can never look at myself and accept myself as a person that smoked weed. And while I wouldn't always advocate for shit like that for everybody, like, oh, people should just smoke weed more. It's like opening up that conversation allows people to have more tools at their disposal to potentially try things and see if they help during certain things. And so I think that decriminalizing drugs to some degree and viewing them more as a mental health thing, even if it's not working in the short term for Portland and some of these other places, I do think that offsetting drugs from a criminal activity more to a mental health activity is, as a society, a better thing for all of us to view it that way, right?
And we have a case study right in Portugal where in about I think it was year 2001 they decriminalized all drugs, and so in the first decade, heroin addicts dropped from 100K to 25K.
Yeah,
they had the lowest drug-related death rate in Europe, 1/10 of the UK, 1/5 of the US. HIV infections declined 90%. The cost was $10 per citizen per year, compared to, this is over a decade, the U.S. spent $1 trillion. So,
but I think it's also important to note the Portugal case study. Like, this wasn't just like you can now freely carry heroin with you. It was a concerted effort on a national level that combined like public funding for mental health treatment. It combined education programs to, help people understand like the cycle of drug use. And one of the most fascinating things, we'll link the article at the bottom of the episode. I think one of the most fascinating things is, ultimately speaking, one of the greatest successes that this effort in Portugal had. And like, for the record, it did start like moving the other direction, because after the Great Recession in 2008, they had to cut funding some of these programs, and now we're kind of seeing
they cut. So this is actually great, because we have the first decade, which shows all these improvements with a certain level of funding, and then they cut the funding from 82 to $17 million over like the next decade, and then shit just went south.
So but it's still not as bad as in other places where you haven't had this kind of concerted effort.
But it shows your point, that you can't just decriminalize; you have to actually aid it with additional measures.
But one of the most important results of this policy was the fact that there was an increased like collective social awareness, Brocke, to the things that you're talking about with like, if somebody's strung out in heroin on the street, that's not an individual failure, which, I mean, agency is a thing, and what the fuck are you doing, shoot up on heroin? But there is an awareness of like, okay, there is like a compounding series of factors that ultimately result in somebody choosing to shoot up and, pass out in public with their pants off. And I think that is something which, if nothing else, like now this Portugal example is being pointed to because the funding got cut. Nobody really talks about that part, but like, see, it failed. People are still using drugs. But like, collectively speaking, if even like the Portuguese boomer generation that survived through like the military junta and like the autocratic like Estado Novo, even if that generation is now able to be like, yeah, well, clearly somebody's just having like a mental health episode. I can't imagine like an American tier boomer in like Dallas, Texas, just like, oh yeah, this is somebody who's got like mental health problems. That's why they're using drugs. But like the foundation of like raising that issue to the level of collective understanding, I think that makes the program already a success. The biggest problem is, and the arguments against it that at least I've read online is immediately they point to places like Portland. They're like, oh, well, see, like Portland tried to do it, like, and they're clearly not succeeding because, opioid overdoses are up 500% or some shit. like we're not seeing anything here in the States on like a national level. Like how different this effort could be if like we recognize this, you know, kind of like with the Nixon administration, the war on drugs. Oh my God, you know, fucking all the first ladies made this like the priorities when they were in office. But like if we just recognize this as like an issue, like an actual national security threat, and that's the only way we can think about things in this country, and we channel the appropriate resources into it, like this could very likely, yes, on the surface, you know, decriminalization, whatever, but like all the other support mechanisms in place, I think we could resolve this like like no problem whatsoever.
Yeah, like a compassionate society, right? Like I think all of us genuinely, I think most people want a compassionate society, a society that you feel like is there in some capacity for you. It doesn't have to be some welfare state, or there's all kinds of, you know, all kind of things you can make for it. But I think ultimately people just want a society that feels like they're accepting and that they're okay and everybody fits into it. And it's fine. You can do what you do. And things like looking at drugs, the war on drugs and stuff like that. It's just such a bullshit. What is it? When like the logical fallacy where you have a straw man, right?
Yeah.
Where it's just so easy to be like, oh, these chemicals are a poison to us. And it's like, no. We are using those things because there is stuff inside of us that is making us sad and feel empty and lonely and whatever. And the more we work on those underlying things to make a society that people feel like things are okay and it's okay to be this type of person, and that we're all, I don't know, like one of the biggest things I noticed from when I initially studied drug research to now, especially post-COVID, is that people, it is the normalization aspect of it, where people, it is so much better for you to be able to say, I'm depressed, you know? Whereas at even just 25 years ago, that wasn't as much of an acceptable thing for you to, people just like, oh, come on, you have everything. Everything's good for you. Why are you sad? Go for a walk. And it's like, now you can come out and people like get it to some degree. Lots of them do, right? And so I think we're all trying to just start making sense of this. And I think drugs should be more under that thing where it's like, I don't know, when you see a fentanyl crisis in Portland, maybe it's not specifically about the fentanyl. Fentanyl obviously is an easy route to it. You know, it's the virus that is taking advantage of whatever's happening there. But it isn't.
And to your point, Brocke, I think the fact this isn't just happening in Portland, like again, like, you know, far from, I think, the public conscious that in America that loves to, you know, point on liberal cities and kind of flag them as like institutional failures. I mean, the fentanyl crisis and the opioid epidemic extends to like it's all corners of the country. Yeah. Like good old red-blooded Republican states.
Yeah. And Portland's just an easy one to go, well, they tried and it failed, so fuck them. Like it's so frustrating to have that attitude. It's such a defeatist. It's like Jordan Peterson drives me fucking nuts.
Yes.
Pulling his shit out, and every time his argument is, it's just too fucking complicated. Just fuck it. Fuck the thing. Climate, that's too, it probably doesn't exist, but even if it does exist, fuck it, it's too hard. It's like, these are such defeatist attitudes to these things. Like, okay, Portland, maybe it didn't work. Maybe whatever they did, you know, like, I think we talked about this last time when I was talking about socialist things, right? Where I identify as a socialist person. Does that mean that I honestly think that all the tenets of socialism that's what's going to solve all our shit? Absolutely not. I just want to fucking talk about it. I want to start absorbing some of the policies that we think might work in some kind of socialist thing and go, hey, does it work? Oh, it didn't? All right, let's try something else. But that's what a smart, self-aware, intelligent, compassionate society does. And we look at the fentanyl crisis and we go, look at those fucking liberal idiots and fentanyl's just wiping them out. And it's like, but they're trying stuff. And even if decriminalizing things isn't the way to go or whatever, right? At least I want just to try stuff. I want to, you know, try to like reframe our perspective on things. I think is a big part of where we're going to actually fix the underlying things of this.
Yeah, man. I mean, and this is kind of what we discussed in the last episode on the meta crisis, but we are in need of a cultural enlightenment, right? And that could be the driving force for implementing a political system that is more conducive to addressing all these problems. But I do want to kind of, so let me see if I can come up with a take-home message that makes sense that we can all agree on. Like, we want a society where drug use is not something that compensates for a lack of other things in your life, but it's something that hopefully enhances your life. It is an enhancement as opposed to making up a deficit that, in theory, we should have a society that addresses that. And so I think that's probably the way to go. But then I think about things like marijuana, which again, it's kind of like now it's obviously seen as a relatively mild recreational drug. But looking at some of the research, we know, if your brain's developing, it's going to have an impact, right? Like that's been, I feel like, pretty well established. Same thing with alcohol. And really the age limit, if you're going to look at it from that perspective, you could say the age limit should be raised to like 25 or whenever your brain's, if you want to be conservative, maybe even 30. But it seems like it could have an addition, like just like alcohol does, even for adults. There are these kind of harmful side effects, and I think we have to be careful when we are promoting any sort of drug. We have to be honest about the costs, and so how do we find that balance? Because we went from the war on drugs. Marijuana was like categorized the same as like some other much harsher drugs, and now we've gone to this. We've swung to the other side where marijuana is like just this absolutely fucking harmless thing. But honestly, from the research I've done, which I haven't looked into marijuana like this since I was maybe 20, and it is not as harmless as you would think. And so how the fuck do we find this balance, and how do we even evaluate whether this is actually good for me? If marijuana, for example, does lead to memory impairment and some other issues, how would you Brocke, if you were trying to evaluate a particular drug and you see some side effects, what's a good kind of heuristic to try to figure out if it's something worth doing?
That's an interesting. So on that point, too, like, I think that like we're not. We've talked a lot about here in this talk, like about like the old good old days of us surviving and all this shit, and those times suck too, right? Like there were tons, your babies died, like you have 12 children and like 8 of them died, right? And so there's shitty things about all these times, and we're not putting this back in the box, right? Pandora's box is open. None of this is life. We've done this. It's happening, right? And so I think drugs are a good way of like just having some more tools at our disposal, right? And viewing them that way. But like your point of, they all come with trade-offs, and it's important. First of all, education is an extremely important part of this whole thing. I teach, whenever I get the chance to, I teach drugs at high school I teach high school, and I teach this as a concept. And I have to be very careful because I don't advocate for drug use, because little snot-nosed teenagers are fucking always trying to get you to validate their drug use. And I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to be like, it's perfectly fine for you to do these things. But at the same time, I also think that it's extremely important that they understand that, these things have consequences. And so it's important that you go into this knowing it. So starting a smoking weed habit or whatever and doing it, it's going to give you certain benefits to something that may offset stress or depression or whatever in your life. But it does come with a cost, right? It does increase the chance of cancer. It does increase like memory loss, right? Like you do have functional memory loss of this. And it is not addictive in the same way that like heroin is addictive, in the sense that it makes these massive like physiological changes to your brain that like you now need heroin day to day, and your body will freak out if you don't have it. Weed doesn't inherently do that like the way that heroin does, but it's still, you are dependent on it, right? You take someone that smokes weed every single day all the time, and then they don't smoke weed one day, their life is very different that day. They feel different. Their whole body is working differently. And so it does make changes to that. And I think you have to decide as a responsible person, the same way that you do with, if somebody brings you a donut, because I hate the fucking slippery slope fallacy for every goddamn, like someone brings you a donut and it's like, if you in that moment eat a donut, it's perfectly fine, right? It really is. Your body can handle that much sugar. It's fine, whatever. But if you make a habit of like always eating donuts when people bring you donuts, then you have this donut habit. And now you're fine. Right? It's slippery slope of whatever kind of thing, right? And so I think to some degree, people should view that as just part of the arsenal of, I have to make sure that I'm falling within responsible use. You know, does that make sense? Of some of the things that I do.
No, it
and
makes
like drugs
sense,
should be a part of that. Yeah.
No, it makes sense. And the donut example is funny because if you're not going to decriminalize like drugs, then I mean, then should you criminalize donuts? You know, I mean, because the sugar and the fat content in that, like, that is more addictive than weed. And look at the obesity epidemic. That's worse than, you know, you can make a strong case. That's worse than the side effects of weed. So, like, you know, it's again, it goes back to like what we mean by drugs. And
but we've also, like, even outside of, like, you know, donuts, yeah, okay, but like our relationship with alcohol, for instance, is like a totally, like, I mean, any TV show features alcohol placement to a certain extent. I mean, Christ, how many alcoholics came out of like Mad Men, right? Where like drinking whiskey and like brooding over your desk at work, it became like an aesthetic basically. But we're totally okay with it. I mean, yeah, like some states have like stricter regulations on who can sell alcohol, and you know, you have to do this weird song and dance, like, hey, can't really buy hard liquor on Sundays or something like that. But objectively speaking, alcohol historically has like decimated civilizations. I mean, like the poor Irish and the Russians, like what has it done to their respective cultures, right? But we're still okay with it. You know, we still go to bars, we drink with people, we it's totally socially acceptable for young people to, you know, go party and wake up hungover. Like, we're fine with that. We have like advertisers making commercials for the goddamn Super Bowl next week right now that everybody's waiting for with bated breath. Like, oh my God, like what's Bud Light going to do? But objectively speaking, if you take a lens at it, I mean, it is still technically like a harmful, toxic substance that people get addicted to and that ruins lives. But it's, for some reason, we apply a higher level of agency to that. I think because we don't. What's that?
People go to rehab for alcohol abuse like so much more than they do for other harder drugs. Like, it's one of those things. I mean, you see celebrities that are doing all kinds of drugs, but then they go checked in for alcohol abuse. Yeah. And it's because I think a big part of it is because it's normalized. It feels, especially when you have this like dark side of drugs. There's drugs, and then there's drugs, and it's just all fucking drugs. It's just drugs, right? And so, you know, like, I think when we start looking at it like that, like alcohol falls in the drug. It's murder, right? Drugs, right? You can fuck it up, but overall, and it's like, it's a drug. It's the same damn thing. And there's ethical use of it, and there's a non-ethical use of it, right? And so I think a lot of our drugs should just become more in that thing where it's like allowed. Because like if someone comes to you and says like, hey, like if you had a real friend, like a real scenario where a friend came to you and said, hey, I've been using heroin recently. Like, you're going to be, but like, think about the way that you would feel about that. If you really care about this person, right? Like, you're going to have like, you know, and I think that we should have drugs that we all recognize are problematic, right? But that, when you look at that person taking heroin, you're not immediately just like, oh, what a piece of shit this guy is now doing this shitty illegal thing or whatever. Like, you would be concerned about that person. Like, what's happening to you? What's going on with you? Like, what? You're not going to just start yelling at them for using heroin. You're going to like, hey, what's going on? Like, why? And it's not, the thing you're treating isn't like, hey, like, what, did you fall in? Did someone just stick you with a heroin needle and now suddenly you have to have it? Like, you're going to be like, what are the things that are causing this to happen? And so I think that we obviously still need to have like a stern discussion, kind of to your point too, Lamont, of like, drugs are still bad. Like, they do have bad things. They take consequences. But like, imagine if you could like take a drug and like, I don't know, think of like a video game, you know? And like, it's like a thing you click and your character gets this new imbued power. And it's like, you click this thing and your life bar goes from 100 to like 90, right? And you're like, oh, I lost life on that, right? But the trade-off is you have so much less stress, you know? So like that 90 now is like a better 90. Like, you get to enjoy the quality of your life or something. It's obviously never going to be that black and white or whatever, right? The things aren't going to be like that. But there are trade-offs. And I do think that in some ways there are certain things where you're like, I'm willing to take on the risk and the consequences of what that thing might have for ultimately. And then there's just certain drugs like fentanyl that just aren't ever going to be that. And they're the final boss of, you know, where that seeking drug thing ends up, you know? And so I think it's so convenient for us to, like that video, to look at those people that are in the late stages of all this tapestry of shit that's gone wrong for them. Those people in that video, their problem isn't just inherently trank or fentanyl or whatever the fuck that they're on. Yes, that's what's making them look like zombies, but overall, they have made choices in their life have gone. And again, whether they had agency, so much agency over it or not, or trauma or whatever the hell, their life has led them to this point. And they are in a final crisis of shitty life, right? That drugs are one component of that thing. And it's the one that we focus on. We're like, that person's on fentanyl, fuck that guy. Look at all these terrible things that are happening in Philadelphia. And yeah, the drugs are part of it, but they are a component. They are one component of the whole thing. And so there could have been times where drugs might have been a beneficial thing if you hadn't, I don't know, if you hadn't done that drug with this drug or whatever.
Drugs are a symptom. Society is the disease.
Yeah. I think I was thinking about this the other day because I think a good example of this is Elon Musk. Like, what more privilege could you possibly fucking have than this human being? And we can all see him degrading. Like, he is doing way too much ketamine now. And this is a billionaire that's doing this shit. And it's like, he's not even doing this like as a thing. Like, there's an example of like he has all the money in the world to do whatever he needs for his own interests, and he's just taking a fucking horse tranquilizer and shit and just fucking himself up on it. So I don't know. I think that the discussion of drugs isn't black and white, right? I don't think we should just all use drugs, but I also think that we should normalize the idea that drugs can still be a compensatory thing, that they are okay for you to look into. I
think that word is gone. Like, we can't use the word drugs. It's just there's just too much baggage. So what's the new word? What can we use?
Chemical prosthetics or some shit.
I like that.
Make it sound medical. Make it sound
prosthetics.
Yeah, we're gonna give you this neurotransmitter chemical prosthetic to help you. No one would question. If you told my mom that, she'd be like, "Yeah, I'll smoke this thing." Like, if a doctor said some shit like that, for sure. Okay, sure. But the drug thing. You're right. We attach such weird things to names too much, and they just get lost in the process of of what the actual thing could do or be for us. It becomes a phenomenon past the actual thing itself.
All right. I think
natural pause.
That was a beautiful, productive.
Yeah. I always like the way these things meander, evolve. I have these ideas, and I'm like, oh yeah, you guys come up with some really interesting things for it.
No, I think your message is great, Brocke. I think we do have to destigmatize drugs. I think we do have to decriminalize it to a certain extent. Whether that includes the hardest drugs, I don't know, but the Portugal case study does provide some hope in that respect.
I mean, they're also like Portuguese. They have the beautiful Atlantic coast. They have like public transportation.
They got some other shit going on over there that might also be contributing factor.
Yeah. It's like, oh man, of course I don't need to like shoot up on heroin. I could go take a walk by like crystal clear blue water and ancient architecture that's designed for like the average human.
Are you saying that us like going to Applebee's can't compensate for
right
the hit in our lives?
No, that's funny. Yeah, the rehab clinics in Portugal are like on the beach. There's like a bonfire, people playing volleyball, surfing. Yeah,
that's amazing. Yeah.
All right. Well, that was a brilliant episode, Brocke. Do you want people to reach you anywhere on your Instagram, Twitter, whatever?
Any writing you want to plug? Anything of yours to advertise to the 220 people that we reach on a consistent basis?
I mean, that's cool though. I'm glad it seems to be growing, you guys. Like the podcast has gotten it's going awesome. I like it. I don't have anything to promote really. I mean, I'm not like, to your credit about social media too. About 5 years ago, I was obsessed with it. I mean, I was getting literally several hundred notifications a day, and many of them I would check on and answer and reply and all the things, right? And I'm not on Twitter at all anymore, and I have an Instagram, but I barely look at it. And honestly, it has been such a good thing for my whole deal. I think COVID really helped push that, where it was just like, I don't think people need to give a shit about what I'm doing right now. I don't think they need to know what I'm eating. So I don't know. I've moved away from some of that stuff. So if people want to reach out to me, they can feel free to, like, I do have an Instagram. And then, I don't know, you can find tons of shit of me online. My first name has an E on it, Brocke. So you type that shit in. I'm one of the only people on the planet that has that. So feel free to reach out or talk. I mean, I'm always like into chatting with people about some of these things. Right. I'm part of an institute we were talking about right before this started. Like, my wife is building an institute for stress and resilience here in Northern California. And the whole idea is that we're trying to push a lot of stress research to make it more normalized as a diagnostic tool for doctors to be able to say, right? Because right now we have to turn it into something else, right? Hey, this person's having a really terrible time, and they are having panic attacks constantly, and you got to be like, whoa, their thyroid is dysregulated. We can't just say this person's really fucking stressed, and it is causing a tremendous amount of illness in this person. And so we're trying to make this more of a thing. So we have clinicians on site here. So I will say, like, this is a big thing that me and my wife and the people around us are day-to-day working on and trying to make more of a, a normalized thing, right? Not so much the drug thing, right? Specifically. Although I will say we have, we've been having talks with a group called MAPS, which is, I always have to look at Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies. And they are now like wanting to do some stuff with our institute and doing like some funding things with us. And it's cool because like they're really trying to do some of that normalization of looking at these. It's like, it's not just, dead heads sitting around a fire like, like these things can genuinely be used to help people have like turning points and trauma and therapy and stuff like that. And so the second with like you said, Levon, like just reverting this like from this drug term to seeing it as something different, something that is a useful tool for us. So I would say that, like, anything like that. If we want to reach out or chat or something about that, like I'm all about that kind of thing.
Well, it's always good to have you on.
Yeah.
Hopefully we can bring you back when we're at like millions of listeners. We'll do little check-ins periodically. Like we said, you're kind of our go-to point of contact with, hey, what the fuck is going on in America? So next time we see like a spicy viral video filed under evidence of society's decay, we'll be sure to run it by you.
Maybe we can like piggyback on like Joe Rogan's success and just I'll come on. I'll be like, you guys tried DMT? Maybe that'll you guys should just do some DMT about it.
Yeah, we'll take it live and see where the conversation goes. Really just Hunter S. Thompson, this whole podcast thing. Like,
I love it. I love that. All right. Well, thank you guys.
Awesome.
I appreciate it.
Thanks a bunch, man. We'll see you next time.
Thank you.